Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining WatchGuard today for our webinar on understanding the opportunity, DORA and NIS2 compliance for MSPs. Very excited to have you joining us today for our webinar. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into a bit of an agenda here. So we'll start off with a simple threats landscape primer, really contextualizing compliance, not just on the NIS2 and DORA side of the house, but really globally, what's going on in the compliance arena and how the threat landscape is driving that. We'll talk about the shift in thinking that a lot of governments are going through when they look at cybersecurity and relate that to compliance. We'll talk about some of the emerging compliance standards before we jump into a more detailed discussion around NIS2 and DORA, which are obviously very relevant for the EU, and that's the region they really focus on. We'll finish up on the back end of the presentation, talking a little bit about what this means for MSPs, right? So what's the opportunity? What do you need to do to prepare yourself to take advantage of the opportunity of compliance among your clients, among your prospects, and really how you're trying to grow your practice there. And then finally, we'll talk about working with WatchGuard. You know, how we've helped MSPs today address compliance challenges, get their house in order, and some of the things that we've recently really introduced to the portfolio to add value there. So that just gives you a sense of our presentation today. And with that, I'll go ahead and jump right into the content. So as I said, starting right off the bat with a bit of about the threat landscape, right? And you know, I'm a marketing guy, right? So in some ways, it's my job to scare you a little bit. But this number actually scared me when I really started assembling the understanding of the threat landscape and sort of updating my knowledge. And that is that today or this year, by the end of this year, we expect the global cybercrime economy to be worth roughly $10.5 trillion. Right? And to put that another way, if it was its own country or its own economy, right, compared to other countries, that would be the third largest economy today. And so understand that figure as the number or the amount of money that's being siphoned out of our companies, our governments, our people, right, all around the globe by cybercrime today. And that's not just necessarily, let's say, the ransomware payments. It's the cost of downtime. It's the overall impact to the economies at large, driven by cybercrime specifically, right? And if you look at that another way and sort of narrow in on the focus of something like ransomware, you know, today ransomware has a higher return on investment than drug trafficking did in the 90s, right? Extremely lucrative, not a very, especially when you're looking at the actual cost up front, very minimal cost structure relative to something like drug trafficking, moving drugs across borders, producing those things, and then all of the safety and security mechanisms to maintain those supply chains, so to speak, right? A lot less challenges in those areas for ransomware, right? A lot easier to perpetrate your attack and make those lucrative attacks. And we see this, right, with the rise of the ransomware as a service marketplace on the dark web, right? Today, there are ransomware kits that go for $100 on Telegram, on the dark web, right? In these areas of the internet that allow potentially less skilled cyber actors to upskill, right, to get access to new tools and capabilities, right, and pay a fee rather than having to learn a completely new technique, right? There's this entire ecosystem and economy under the sheets here, so to speak, at work, right, where you know, the more effective tools are going to get the more downloads, more purchases, right, and the ones that are less effective, they're not going to have as much of a marketplace. There's a competition here in this ecosystem that's really driving down costs, driving up effectiveness, right? And that's really pushing a lot of the extremes when it comes to the vulnerabilities for our organizations. And then the final point here, and I'll talk a bit more about this idea over the next couple of slides, is that over 30 countries are funding offensive cyber operations today. Right, and of course, the United States is almost certainly doing some of this ourselves. But I think what's different now, and where this $10.5 trillion figure really starts to balloon is some of the countries that are fall under this 30 plus figure here are actually using cybercrime to generate huge volumes of revenue for certain projects. Let's say within North Korea, we can tie some of their ransomware efforts to actually funding their military expansion in innovation engines, right? They're using cybercrime as a strategy to fund their government, to fund their countries, right? That's a paradigm shift. And that's something that we've really seen take hold in the last 7 to 5 years as we looked at the threat landscape. So just wanted to start out at a high level and really put my thumb on the scale about really how severe the threat landscape is today, just at that high level. And now we'll talk about it in a little bit more detail. And so ultimately, this dynamic, right, the expansive, virulent nature of the threat landscape has changed really the cybersecurity thinking for a lot of governments around the world, right? Um, Cyber attacks today are now, in my opinion, rightly seen as economic warfare and potential political destabilization, right? You know, I mentioned the example of North Korea using attacks to essentially siphon money to fund government operations. But we've also seen, you know, things like misinformation, disinformation. We've seen attacks against government organizations to take down their ability to deliver services, right? And the point here is that state-backed cyber attacks are rising, right? You look at what Russia did in Ukraine specifically and how they've shown that they can use malware to cripple the economy there. Not just their kinetic attacks, but actually you coordinate that with cyber efforts as well. We've seen similar attacks on the energy grids and infrastructure in Europe, really highlighting vulnerabilities in the weaknesses of sort of the traditional defense approaches, right? They're really showing us that it's possible to knock down our access to utilities and our ability to actually operate, not just on the business level, but as an whole economy here. And they're also increasingly targeting critical sectors, right? I think we all remember the ransomware period where we saw spikes against healthcare organizations and hospitals, you know, and these cyber attacks really spiked during this period, where we would think, you know, globally, everybody's sort of grappling with this same challenge around a healthcare issue, and we'd want to believe that, you know, you wouldn't touch these types of institutions that are really core to saving lives, you know, across these different countries. But that's exactly the opposite of what we saw. The cyber actors recognized that they had us in a bind. If they could hold a hospital ransom, right, we were more likely to pay that ransom probably during that time period than maybe at any other period of time. And they were taking advantage of that, right? And we should expect that same type of approach with other sort of inflection points in the geopolitical landscape. We're seeing financial systems specifically being targeted for economic disruption, right? And ultimately, all of this is coming to changing the view for the governments, not just in the EU, but all around the globe, as they talk about cyber issues. And the old view really was cyber threats were more of a problem for businesses to manage privately, right? They really looked at cybersecurity as something that you should build around best practices simply because it'll make you more viable as a potential business partner. It would make you more viable and secure for your own operations. There's a view change that's gone on, I think, really in the last 5 years, in that these governments are starting to view cyber threats much more as a systemic risk and understanding that everyone has a legal duty to prevent them. And what that means is it's no longer just the large enterprise businesses that are subject to emergent compliance mandates around cybersecurity. It's now really their whole supply chain and even the mid and smaller businesses that play in some of these critical industries. And we'll talk about what those look like in the next couple slides. But the thing I want you to understand here is that it's a much broader scope of compliance here than it's ever been, and we should really expect that to continue to broaden as that really holistic understanding of the vulnerabilities of businesses and our larger economies really becomes clearer and clearer. And so that really has led to the creation of two new regulations, relatively new regulations in the European Union specifically. And those are the things we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail today. And that's the Network and Information Security Directive 2, so the second variant of this directive, and the Digital Operations Resilience Act. And so a little bit different flavor here and sort of different focus. I'll talk about the differences between these two in more detail. But at a high level, what you need to understand is NIS 2 is more about sort of that critical service, critical operations, so things like utilities, manufacturing, all those societal elements that are so important. It's about keeping society alive, if you will, where DORA is much more focused on the financial aspects behind the scenes, right? So, you know, the really different approach, but a lot of weight put behind both of these in the EU, as we'll see going forward here. And so these are just two of the compliance standards, right? And as I mentioned, they're specific to the EU, but this trend is going on all around the globe, right? Where governments, legislative bodies are understanding the importance of providing standards and guidance and mechanisms to assess the compliance with these standards in place, really as an effort to protect all of us, to protect our governments, our businesses, our economies, right? Our society at large, right? And so here's an example of a number of these different compliance standards across different regions of the world, be it the California Privacy Rights Act, right? China's own data security laws, where there's done a large re-architecture of global data flows for themselves, right? The cybersecurity maturity model, right, which is specifically for SMBs who want to work on U.S. defense projects, right? We're even seeing some emergent standards around artificial intelligence, right? And so defining what the backbone of trustworthy AI deployments look like, because all of these governments, all of these organizations understand the implications of failures here when it comes to cybersecurity, right? It's not just going to be one organization, it's the entire supply chain. It's that domino effect for all of these organizations when they potentially become subject or fall victim to an attack. And so, from a trend perspective, a couple of things to note here. You're seeing things like cybersecurity and privacy standards really start to blend together, right? We should expect to see that future regulations will start to really treat cyber risk and privacy as one issue. I think this makes a ton of sense, right? If you know what's happening from a threat attack perspective, increasingly things like phishing and targeted phishing attacks are being used to circumvent traditional, let's say, perimeter firewalls and get beyond the traditional security mechanisms that are in place. And a lot of those attacks rely on things like social engineering, this idea that I can tailor my message, I can tailor potentially my phone call, whatever that is, for a specific target victim, right? And I can use social media, I can use different things to help increase the potential success of that initial communication, right? And so privacy, it makes sense to consider privacy here for your users as part of this holistic understanding of your security approach. You're also seeing more cross-border restrictions, right? And this is especially true in Europe, where data sovereignty is specific, and specific countries take this more seriously than others, is a real big business concern. They don't want their data to leave, let's say, Germany as an example, and be hosted in another part of the world, in another, in the United States, in Russia, wherever that might be. They have major concerns about where that's being stored. And then really when the AI government standpoint, right? This is a fairly new frontier. We all understand that we're on the precipice of fairly significant changes as a result to AI, not just in how we operate our businesses, but really is in society at large. And so there's a lot of discussion about how AI is used in relative to those spaces, but also we should expect that there'll be even more and more compliance standards and guidance around those systems being pushed into the businesses that we serve as MSPs going forward. And we've seen with the NIS2 example, right, that a lot of these compliance mandates, they're an evolutionary process, right? NIS2, originally the initial requirements for governments having some policies in place was October of last year, and sort of that implementation status really depends on which country you're talking about, right? So you can see here just at a high level, very few countries have already implemented this fully as of April of this year. There's still a number of governments that are rolling out these standards and are still defining them. So it's not so in one sense it's not too late to start building your conversation and helping organizations understand what's coming in some of these regions that may have not already implemented yet today. And so ultimately, why is compliance an opportunity for organizations, right? For a lot of the same reasons you would see in cybersecurity opportunity. One of the big ones is talent shortage, right? If you're an MSP today, chances are you're making a lot of your opportunities simply because your prospects, your clients don't want to scale their own teams to handle a lot of these tech challenges, a lot of these cybersecurity skill needs that they would need to stay ahead of cyber threats. And the same thing applies here on compliance, right? Chances are these organizations would be considering somebody to handle compliance, or at least to become their compliance expert within their organization. Those are rare skill sets today, right? It's a much more technical position that a lot of your mid-market organizations will be comfortable sourcing themselves, right? So this is an opportunity for you to provide a little bit of that subject matter expertise around some of these compliance initiatives, and be that trusted advisor as they're trying to understand what to do. And so that sort of it helps you overcome some of their talent shortage challenges. 14% growth in compliance services, right? So if you're focused on cybersecurity today, we've seen a lot of commoditization in the traditional cybersecurity capabilities that are being offered. There's a faster growth rate when it comes to being able to solve some of the compliance challenges, and so building services around those opportunities is a good way to grow a little bit faster than some of your traditional maybe offerings. And in that same sense, compliance is a differentiator, right? Those who get this right and are able to speak confidently and with full throat about these different compliance mandates and the implications for their clients, right? That's a big differentiator. That's a big value for all of these organizations, and really makes you sticky as that trusted partner. And ultimately that will result in longer term revenue, right? You're going to avoid those sort of one-off projects where we might rack and stack a firewall, get it deployed, right? Now you have, and you'll see this in some of the requirements, you have an opportunity to provide more ongoing touch points with their clients, provide more value on a recurring basis, and not so many of these one-off projects, right? Again, it makes you stickier within these organizations as you add more value and become more intrinsic to how they actually operate their business. So what's the difference between NIS2 and DORA, right? Obviously, very different focus on who they're specifically targeting, the entities they're specifically targeting. But at a high level, really NIS2 focuses on broader critical infrastructure protection, right? So all of these things that are part and parcel to how society operates today. It's about providing cyber resilience for those essential services. So things like health care, transportation, digital infrastructure, our energy, our utilities, right? Are those things that keep the lights on, the water flowing, right? That if they were to turn off tomorrow, not just individual businesses would recognize, but really entire countries, entire economies would see in rather short order. We saw yesterday as an example, although I haven't heard the actual cause of it yesterday, but the major issues that Spain had with some of their utilities and their ability to actually keep their transportation infrastructure operating. The implications of disruption here are immense, and the cost impact of it, just that event, which again may not be a cyber event specifically, but just sort of demonstrates the potential impact there. The cost of those types of things will not be understood until months and years after the fact, right? And so if you're an MSP, right, you are directly regulated if you're in a country that's implemented NIS2 today and has these already in place, right? So this means you'll have to meet specific cybersecurity obligations. You'll have some requirements around reporting incidents, and you can be fined directly, right? And so the fine structure really varies, but it's about up to 10 million euros or 2% of annual turnover. And I think the real thing on both of these compliance initiatives to understand is there's real teeth behind these for failing to provide the security and do the things that you're supposed to be doing in line with compliance. When you look at incident reporting, right, there's mandatory across both of these requirements for reporting. Although on NIS2, there's a requirement around the timeliness of the reporting within 24 hours of that initial detection and a full report within 72 hours. And this applies, again, directly to MSPs. But this is extremely important when you're talking about this with your clients, right? Their ability to respond, provide that initial alert and then a full report within 72 hours when they might not have a bench of, let's say, security experts who are really able to make sense of what's going on in their environment, or they might not have a tool set that makes that easier for them to really understand across different siloed security. That's a big, big challenge for a lot of these mid-market organizations. Right, I mentioned the implementation date. So they're sort of relying on the different countries within the EU to stand up their own laws in line with NIS2. This initial process was supposed to be implemented, or at least started by the countries on October 17th, right? And I shared with you this is a bit of a slow roll on for some of the countries, but a number of them have implemented already, and we should expect over the next year or so for the others to really start standing these things up to a different degree as well. And again, from an audit perspective, MSPs can be directly audited, investigated, and fined by these different agencies under NIS2, right? And so for DORA, it's a laser focused approach really for financial institutions, right? And ultimately what we're trying to do is ensure that IT disruptions don't break the financial system, right? We want to make sure that businesses can operate, they can still trade, they can do all of these things, right? In the face of cyber attacks and making sure that we're really set up for success there. And so this really looks at only the financial sector. So banks, insurers, right, payment providers. But if you're providing critical third-party IT services as a third-party provider, right, and they have some definitions of what critical means, right, you would potentially be subject to some of these requirements as well. So as an MSP, you could be indirectly regulated if you're serving finance, right? And so that would mean you would have to have your security posture, and even to some degree, your contracts must meet specific requirements around DORA. And so from a penalty standpoint, a little bit less, it's a 1% global daily turnover for non-compliance for up to 6 months, right? Again, pretty impactful, still some teeth there. But maybe not as impactful potentially, although there's the higher 10 million limit on NIS. But again, some teeth behind it, right? Incident reporting, there's a mandatory reporting process here, but it's more about, with the DORA approach, more about information sharing and really sharing when their service was disrupted or contributed to an incident, less about the timeliness of the turnaround and sort of the depth of the report that must be provided. And enforcement for DORA started as of January 17th of this year, right? So this is in effect today throughout the EU. And again, if you're an MSP, there are specific audit rights that you may have to comply with if you're really determined to be a critical provider of these services. That would change potentially the scope of your analysis or assessment by these governing bodies. And so why now? I mean, we talked about some of the threat landscape to start the presentation, but if you really look at some of the specifics around NIS and DORA, right? 66% of organizations were hit by ransomware last year, right? That's a huge percentage, and that's an attack that not only is going to hold your systems ransom, it really is effective at locking down systems, stealing data, and preventing you from operating as an organization. We tend to think of it as a way to just siphon off money, but really the impact here of holding you hostage is the salient concern when we're talking about some of these compliance mandates in finance and in the critical infrastructure side. We've seen a 4 times increase in supply chain attacks. And, I mentioned at the top of the presentation that mid-market, smaller organizations that now play in these larger ecosystems, right? They're increasingly being exploited to introduce cyber attacks, to infiltrate into larger organizations, to attack, critical utilities and things. And so a lot of these organizations, the larger organizations, are really requiring some of their smaller supply chain partners to prove their own security postures going forward. And some of the compliance mandates are starting to take those types of things into consideration as well. And then finance is among the most targeted sectors. It's the second most targeted sector today outside of manufacturing, right? So this is why DORA is so critically important. Where that targeting continues to grow, it's a lucrative area to target, even though there's a lot of security capability in the financial sector, among the banks. They're still among the most highly targeted, and that's because it can be so impactful and lucrative when you're successful here. And then, I think one of the overarching things that's going on in the European Union that's relevant here is that, digital transformation spending is growing, right? All of these organizations that sort of fall under the purview of these compliance mandates, they're not just concerned about security. Ultimately, they're concerned about growing efficiency, growing profitability themselves. That's their mindset is growth, and transformation is a process to get there. So this idea that compliance and security requirements will somehow stop them from transforming is something they're not really willing to consider. They need to be able to weather the security and compliance challenges while staying on top of their transformation goals to really ultimately meet their growth goals. So now is a time where we really can get in front of some of these organizations and start to help them navigate these waters, to help them keep on track and safe as they grow their businesses. And so the opportunity overlap, right? If we look specifically as an MSP, at these compliance mandates, and maybe where you have an opportunity to get in front of a prospect and share where you can add some value, right? So things like risk assessments, right? There's a need for each one of these assessments to be able to baseline clients' exposure, right? To go in and be able to say, here's a level set of how you stand against these compliance mandates today, where you need to improve, where you need to invest, right? And give them a sense of what the effort's going to be to get there. Things like security policy, right, and identity access control, giving them the ability to enforce things like network and endpoint control. So if you get a piece of malware and endpoint, as an example, you can knock it off the network and prevent a malware spread. That's something that NIS 2 requires, where DORA does not. Both require identity and access control. So things like multi-factor authentication, zero trust types of approaches, right? And so you can see that there's a pretty significant overlap. I think one of the other big areas is threat monitoring and detection. And we'll talk about why that's important and relevant for this conversation. But there's a requirement that you have 24/7 threat visibility and alerting capabilities today. It's not enough that you start your day and see everything that happened last night, while things were burning. You may be away from your systems, right? There is that persistent monitoring need. And this is very important for MSPs, right, who are starting to build their own detection and response, or MDR type of service offerings, and providing 24/7 coverage for their clients. There's a growing need being driven by compliance here. And then simple things like reporting and documentation, right? How are you going to present your audit readiness, show your dashboards, really make it easier to understand what your current posture is relative to these various these mandates, right? And so there's value that really WatchGuard can provide with each one of these, and I'll talk about that as we go through the various few slides to finish up the presentation here. But just wanted to give you a sense that, you can really start to add a lot of value by focusing on some of the needs and the overlaps across both of these compliance mandates as you're trying to understand how to build your own offerings and provide more value in compliance generally. And some of the challenges as you're building your offerings for compliance. I think the big one, and this really goes back to the compliance challenges more broadly, is really the headcount, the skill set, right? Up leveling your security, right? Scaling your talent, right? So you really need to, as a starting point, understand your own security posture as an MSP. Again, you're part of that critical service provider ecosystem, right? For a lot of these organizations. So there's specific requirements for your own security capabilities that you would have to adhere to. And I'll talk about some of those on the next couple of slides. And then scaling talent. This isn't necessarily hiring more people, right? It's about, can you use the talent you have today, the technical resources that you have today, to take on more complex challenges, to take on more clients, to broaden your ability to handle more complex challenges. And so part of this is bringing on the right talent, but part of it is giving them the right tool sets to make them more effective as they go about their day to day. Operationalizing reporting and assessments, right? So, you're going to have to do some of this on a cadence, right? So do you have the tools that give you the visibility and capability to perform assessments and sort of metricize success on a regular basis in a way that isn't encumbering for your team? And then finally, supporting ongoing monitoring and detection. I talked a little bit about that on the previous slide, but a lot of the organizations, even in the MSP space, right, their businesses are more value added or even very break fix, right? What we're talking about with these compliance requirements really pushes us much more to that monitoring and detection on an ongoing basis as a requirement, and that's a pretty big uplift for some organizations. So if you're starting to go down that path, it's important that you build that functionality and capability with tool sets that are really designed for the needs of your team, right? And so we'll talk about what that looks like going forward here. And so, I talked about securing your house for NIS and DORA. And so, just to put a little bit more emphasis on that, right? What does that look like, right? You should be going through a process of assessing your own internal security, right? Mapping your processes to these requirements, identifying gaps, right? Not just in how your security stack is functioning, but really what your process for handling incidents and documentations could be. Prioritize critical controls across endpoints, identities, networks, as well as things like third-party services, things like the cloud, right? You really do need to have a holistic understanding of your threat surfaces as an MSP and really be able to identify vulnerabilities across that holistic, layers of security to be ready to handle NIS2 and DORA and be appropriate as a critical provider there. And then, of course, strengthen your controls, right? If you don't have things like MFA, right? If you're not able to do ongoing automated patching and detection of outdated patching, right? If you're not enforcing least privilege today, right? You need to start standing those things up. Implement network segmentation, endpoint protection, right? Endpoint detection and response capabilities. The idea that I could isolate an endpoint that's maybe connecting back to a corporate network remotely, right? Those types of things, building those into your own stack and protecting your users and your own environment is critical. And big part of that is things like XDR, right? That's real-time threat monitoring capability, using tool sets to be able to provide that functionality. Operationalizing your security policies, right? Part of this is clear roles. Maybe you're going to have a subject matter expert that you say, hey, go out and really learn everything you can on nuts and bolts about NIS2 and be our expert, right? Having that sort of role and responsibility, creating the right policies for all of the different risk management, change management, right? Vendor oversight. Even creating policy templates within some of these tools that you can use for, across your various clients, can be very valuable as well. Reviewing your own supply chain, right? So, really engaging with your vendors, with your providers, right? Understanding how they're approaching compliance, how they're able to show their adherence to these compliance mandates, and engaging with them to understand where their potentially risks might implement or might impact your own. And then ultimately being prepared for scrutiny, right? Are you able to attest and demonstrate your success against these mandates? Are you able to show things like enforcement and response? And are you able to report on not just success today, but what that's looked like over a period of time, right? And so, these are all areas as you start to build out your own capability and get your house in order, so to speak, for compliance, you should consider and really start here in getting your ducks in a row, so to speak, to be appropriate as a critical provider of IT services for these mandates. And so that really brings us to the WatchGuard portion of the presentation and some of the ways that we're helping organizations do this today. And one of the big areas that we've introduced in the last year or so is our ThreatSync Plus artificial intelligence platform. And so this is a unified artificial intelligence platform ultimately for detection and response. And so it's a 100% cloud native, right? It's something that is overwatches really your entire network and cloud environment, allows you to plug in your endpoint agents, your authentication capabilities, right? And start to do analysis, start to do detection, right? Allow you to do threat detection, investigation, all that remediation capability, again, across your network, your endpoint, your cloud services, and identity, right? We're bringing that into one artificial intelligence engine that's able to ingest all these different data types and make sense holistically of what's going on within your environment, within your client's environment, right? Within a unified AI system here. And from there, we can actually report against this. And this is what's so relevant when we talk about compliance. I'll talk about this in the next couple of slides, but you're able to report against the threats, the risks, goals, and objectives, right? And those various compliance mandates. And so, if you look at this in another way, this is a tool that helps you scale talent, right? You have very complex environments today, right? Lots of blind spots, lots of new attack vectors that you're dealing with, right? Be it shadow IT on the complexity side, new tools, you don't maybe have the right trained staff everywhere you'd like them to be, right? Lots of misconfigurations potentially within your own environment, your client's environment. And then the emergent attacks, right? Be they vulnerabilities that are being exploited that we've just discovered in the wild, new attack techniques, right? Bringing the artificial intelligence capability of ThreatSync Plus to bear here, right, helps us reduce complexity, right? Makes it easier to deploy our AI-driven detection, makes it easier to surface those very aggressive threats, those sophisticated threats. We're able to provide coverage across multiple threat surfaces here, right? A unified visibility of what's going on within these environments. And ultimately, this helps you build your detection and response capability. So you can do that 24/7 continuous threat monitoring. You can build automation behind some of these things. So if a threat score is detected, let's say on an endpoint, you're able to automatically isolate that endpoint until you can address the issue, right? And provide that overwatch using tools and technology rather than potentially a butt in a seat in that specific example. And it gives you this visibility ultimately across your network and your cloud. And so what we're able to do, again, with that ThreatSync Plus AI engine, is actually start to build some reports on top of it. So you're not just getting the XDR capabilities and functionality, right? We're able to use that visibility and those policies and controls to align them to specific compliance and reporting needs, right? And so we can provide a unified reporting visibility for all your firewall, your router, your switch data, your endpoint data, your cloud data, right? To give you a visible assessment of your security posture against specific compliance mandates, right? And we have these not just for compliance, but we also have them for things like network, right? So just an assessment of your top risks, your management reporting, your SLA metrics, how you've aligned to your service level agreements, and also things like ransomware for a more broad assessment of how your security posture or your client's security posture would be against specific ransomware attack vectors. But we've also built these in specific compliance formats. So we have a tool here called WatchGuard Compliance Reporting, which uses the ThreatSync Plus engine specifically for some of these compliance reports. And I have the example here of our latest DORA report, and we have one for NIS 2 as well that we've recently built. But these are, again, an AI-powered tool that offers over 100 regulatory controls, right, mapped to automated compliance reports. And it also allows you to tweak and do some building of your own if you have, let's say, a specific compliance mandate in a different industry. And I'll talk about what that might look like going forward. But it's a very flexible system that makes it easy for you to build your reports, get that continuous on-demand report creation. These can be run on a cadence, and provides guidance for control improvements, right? So it's not just here's what we found, it's here's what we found, here's why it matters, and here's what you should be doing next. And so these are great reports that you can put in front of your clients as well to help them understand, where they're being successful and where you might be able to provide more value with other capabilities that you offer as you work with these organizations. And just as really another way to sort of look at these reports, right? I've mentioned that ultimately ThreatSync Plus is behind the scenes pulling this data and putting it in a context that makes it valuable for this reporting engine, right? And so if you look at an attack, ongoing attack, and you sort of take these layers of the reports and map them here, you can see an example here of a phishing email where you have that exposed internet surface and service, and the report would show what that initial activity or vulnerability would be. And then the command and control establishment, you can see here 3 examples where across those different reports, command and control activities are captured and served up in reports. And so what this means is, for an ongoing attack, you can see these things within ThreatSync Plus. But if you want to be proactive, you can run these types of reports and establish where there's vulnerabilities within this sort of attack taxonomy, and be able to understand, where they fall and why that's relevant in a sort of a proactive reporting capability that you can share with clients. And so some additional compliance reporting examples, right? We have many reports today built already for things like FFIEC. One of the interesting ones that shows sort of the easy way to build your own custom reports is the Motion Picture Association report. Very stringent requirements for the MPA. You wouldn't necessarily think so, but about controlling their intellectual property and who can share things. And so they have very specific requirements, and we had a partner who was able to build their own report to serve this audience that really makes it easy and automated for anybody working in the Motion Picture Association to demonstrate their compliance. And then things like the Cyber Essentials report. So just to give you a flavor of some of the others that are available today. And then really to finish up the conversation here, right? We've talked a lot about this idea that these compliance requirements have a higher level of cybersecurity requirement for some of the MSPs. And a key area there is this idea about delivering 24/7 protection, persistent overwatch for your clients. And we understand that a lot of MSPs are not ready to take that step. They don't want to necessarily scale their teams, their technical resources today potentially are not scalable to the extent to be able to handle this sort of 24/7 protection or even 8x5 type of protection. And so WatchGuard has introduced our managed detection and response service, right? And this essentially allows you to leverage WatchGuard as a partner, as an extension of your team, right? You could white label our managed detection and response service, essentially going to market as your own managed detection and response service, but using WatchGuard behind the scenes as the backstop to provide that 24/7 protection, all the visibility they need, the automated action, the action against targets, right? Proactive threat hunting within these different environments. And so we provide this ultimately as a holistic service in something that we've introduced in the last year. So it's been very successful in helping partners go to market and solve more complex challenges for their clients without really having to invest in scale dramatically in their own teams. And if you look at this service, from a success standpoint, beyond just the compliance story, right? We've blocked around 850,000 attacks per month. Around 98% of the response tasks, our blocking tasks, are actually automated already using our AI engines and things. And this usually happens within less than 10 milliseconds, right? And if you go back to a slide I had earlier, this ability for threats to linger within your environment for days and weeks, right, is a real concern. We're serving up as part of this service less than 6 alerts per month. So that means for your team, dramatically less that you're having to actually interact with on the client, right? And then there's a less than 6 minute mean time to first response. When we do have some of those alerts and we need to respond, the window to that response is less than 6 minutes, which is a dramatically significant number, and very competitive in the space when it comes to MDR. All right, well, so that brings us to the end of our presentation. Really appreciate you spending a little bit of time with us to learn about not just NIS and DORA, but really the direction of compliance and really how WatchGuard is helping organizations overcome some of these challenges themselves. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if you want to go ahead and drop them in the chat here, and I'll do my best to respond. All right. Doesn't look like there is any questions yet. I think one of the things I would say for everybody on the call, I shared those compliance reports and WatchGuard compliance reporting. A great starting point if you're an MSP today who's not dealing with these compliance audiences could be to sign up for a trial of ThreatSync Plus and our WatchGuard compliance. We have MSP partners today who are running it within their own environments as a trial system and getting really that readout of all their security posture as it relates to these compliance mandates. So they really have their own roadmap of how to get themselves ready as they go out and address clients. But they're also getting the opportunity to really play with these tools, see where they can be successful and get confident in how they could bring them to their own clients by working on it within their own environment. So, that's something that if you're interested in, please reach out to your WatchGuard representative, or you can email me after the call and let me know, and we can get that process started for you. But it looks like there's no additional questions. Again, if you have any questions after the call, please feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to respond at any time. But thank you very much for your attendance today, and I hope it was valuable.